You've done some work recently on temperament,
Right.
and temperament is one of those constructs that scientists have worked very hard to produce very good operational definitions. So would
Sure.
you start by describing to us how scientists generally operationally define temperament?
Well, there's aspects of temperament, right? So temperament speaks to sort of this hardwired way of being in the world. And there's a lot of information now on kind of where that might come from and how does it start. There's a great new book out called The Orchid and the Dandelion that's all about kind of how we come into the world wired in a certain way. And some kids, some babies are just wired to be a little more sensitive, reactive, alert, whatever. I just say on. And then Thomas and Chess, who were the big pivotal temperament people, came up with, what is it, like 6 areas, general areas. And those are pretty much accepted even now. There's reactivity and regularity and mood and approach, meaning just is somebody, I say an innie or an outie, do they go toward the world, or are they more cautious and hold back? But those are pretty agreed on. And I don't think anyone's really added to it that much since that time. So those are pretty
And
well
those
known.
dimensions, they're dimensions so that a baby could be relatively higher or relatively lower or anywhere on the continuum,
Right.
right? And
Right.
then I think there are 7 dimensions.
7.
And so then there's this concept of a difficult child. And so that's a conglomeration of where people are uncertain of those dimensions, right?
Yeah, yeah, and of course it really means what behaviors present the most difficulty for parents as well, right? If you have a reactive, intense, fussy, difficult to soothe baby, that's difficult. I would agree with that. It is difficult for sure. Um, the issue is that there's just boatloads of research on the bad outcomes of a difficult temperament, right? Like poorer parenting, parents are depressed, kids are more likely to have conduct problems, they're more likely to have ADHD, like this like bad news. It's just bad news. Um, and so um, this partly comes from me having had one of these children. Actually, I had 2. So I understand the inside of the experience. And one thing I was absolutely noticing about my daughter is that she was all reactive, intense, tough to soothe, didn't want to be left alone. Like she really wanted interaction, didn't want to sleep ever. But I, at the time, really saw that there were that was part and parcel of her also being incredibly engaged in the world and incredibly open to experience and eager and all this good stuff. And of course, I was reading books on temperament, right? And a lot of them had different constructions, but also this kind of upside downside kind of idea, like, hey, here's the tough stuff, but here's some really great stuff that's in there. And I think for me as a mom, the great stuff helps you cope with the rough stuff, right? Because you see that there's like a good part of it. So the more I kept tracking the research on temperament, the more I realized that there was this kind of idea didn't exist in the research. This kind of upside downside, it was all downside. And so I wanted to contribute a little bit of research to document that, hey, these kids that are considered temperamentally difficult also may have some really positive stuff in there that we are overlooking. We're completely missing it within the research. So I took some of the constructions of Mary Kurchinka, Spirited Child, Elaine Aron, Highly Sensitive Child. There's some stuff on early giftedness, because we know that kids who later are not diagnosed, what do they call it? Tested as gifted, they're labeled as gifted, had terrible troubles as infants. Many of these problems, and partly because they're like really smart. So I took some of that understanding and those constructions of temperament, and I deployed this big survey and asked parents about those things, how would you rate your child, on perceptiveness or persistence. Now, persistence is one of those things that can be both a downside, both a challenge and a strength at the very same time, right? Like we want our kids to be persistent, just not when they're two. But I consider it a positive trait. I mean, ultimately it's positive. It's just not convenient. So persistence, perceptiveness, sensitivity, so sort of emotional sensitivity, like being really attuned to justice or ethics or social dynamics, or like to other kids being bullied or excluded, those kids that really kind of sense things, right? And I just asked a ton of parents. I mean, I think I got 850 complete responses.
Wow. Okay, wait. So you took these concepts that you pulled out of books that had been written for the general public, and then as a scientist, you had to operationalize them. And so to operationalize them, you wrote items and asked parents to agree or disagree.
Yeah, we did. I did a response scale. So, one question was like, how well does your child, or how much does your child notice subtle changes in their environment, like something being moved or small changes in routine, like that. And then it was like 1 to 10, like doesn't really notice or notices every single little thing, to 10. And I just had them, rate their child. Now,
And what about the issue of social desirability? Because you're also using Parent Report.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. I didn't feel like these were things that people would be particularly motivated to, it's not like saying, do you think your child is gifted? Like, then you might think, you have those things that might have a parent go, yes, I do. But I think, saying, does your child react to loud noises, or noisy places? Does your child...
They don't have a clear right or wrong, desirable or undesirable answer.
No, and in fact, a lot of parents that I talk to when I work on sleep, when I bring up temperament as possibly a big reason why their child isn't sleeping, it's like a whole new idea to them. Like they never thought of it, ever. So I think there's a lot of parents who don't really think about temperament that much, or they may not see it as a driving force in their kids' behavior. So asking about some of these behaviors, I think, are pretty neutral. So.
Okay, well, tell us how you got a group of people to fill out your survey, and who these people were, what they were like.
Yeah, well, predominantly white, predominantly well-educated. Yeah. So it's part of the problem of, when you don't have a budget, and the university that I work for does not have a research thing. So I was kind of on my own to recruit. And so if you're recruiting online, you kind of get who you get. And generally it's a pretty skewed sample. So we cannot possibly say this, even with big numbers, that this is going to generalize, because it's a really skewed sample.
How did you recruit? How did you?
So I'm really lucky. I work with Kim West, who is a sleep book author, and she has a massive, reach of parents, all kinds of parents. And she put it out on her kind of network. She has like a newsletter and an email list, and just a big reach of really all kinds of parents. They're not all her sleep people. It's just people. And I think I did a Facebook ad, things like that. So it was all online. But I did get, I said I got 850 completed. I got maybe 1,200 people who responded. Bless their hearts. Thank you so much. Because it was a long survey. And then I touch on it in my poster, the qualitative results, which really I also encourage people, if you're doing a survey, add in some open-ended questions, because that stuff can be gold. I mean, it reminds you that these are human beings who have lives and attitudes and struggles, and qualitative responses, I think, allow them to say maybe something that they didn't get to say in the survey. And you just it can be, for me, it was touching and sort of heartbreaking. I think there was parts of it that were a little heartbreaking because I had 2 questions about temperament. One, I just said, say 3 words about your child's temperament. And then I said, say 3 words about your experience of parenting this child. And those I did split up into sort of the high difficult kids and the low and everybody else. And what was really interesting when you put those lists of words side by side, the high difficult parents, it was all exhausted, frustrating. I don't know if I'm doing a good job. You know, somebody said, I wish I didn't have this child. Oh, you know, I mean, it was just, I mean, there was positive stuff in there, but you could really feel that these folks were exhausted and really working hard and thinking they weren't doing a good job. That was number one. And then you compared it to the low difficult parents, and they were like easy, fun, joyful. Like not one high difficult parent said easy, not one, you know? And I don't think you get that from a question with a number. That only comes from qualitative answers.
What did you learn from so what you learned from the qualitative stuff was kind of this empathy or insight really into what their life is like. What did you learn from the quantitative data?
So a lot of it was borne out. So the kids that difficult, the higher scores on this difficult, I didn't mention this, I used a subscale of a temperament questionnaire, and that it was a difficult subscale. So to measure difficult temperament, what I found, it was at higher scores, so more difficult kids, for sure, way more problems with intensity and meltdowns and all those problems. But they also did score higher on many of those other variables that I mentioned: perceptiveness, sensitivity, emotional sensitivity, like perfectionism. There was a lot of really interesting stuff that absolutely correlated with being higher on the difficult scale. And that was really interesting. The other piece, I really was able to document two things. One, some anecdotal stuff, which people have felt that things like colic and reflux and some of that stuff, a difficult birth was related to a difficult temperament. So I did ask those questions, and yes, they were slightly more likely to have had colic, eczema, reflux, apnea. Moms were slightly more likely to have had a difficult labor or difficult birth. Interesting, right?
Yeah. Things we think are purely physical,
Right.
physiological, and wouldn't really be, temperament, but they are.
That's what I mean. It's sort of anecdotal. So when I work with a lot of these parents, often this stuff is in there. Oh, my baby's got eczema. I always go, oh, eczema. Okay. Temperament. It's not always, but so that was interesting. And then the other thing that was really interesting is I asked parents 3 questions. Rate your level of emotional fatigue, rate your level of physical fatigue. And then I had a very short battery on parental sense of competence. And of course, parents were way more emotionally and physically exhausted, and they scored lower on their sense of their own competence. So I did see that a challenging temperament takes a toll on parents. But my feeling is if they could be shored up by knowing that there's good stuff in there, maybe some of those scores would improve, right?